Welcome to the severe setup. Adesanya or Plessis, versus Adesanya, the long-awaited grudge match, should we say? I'm joined by Spencer Kite. It may say on the screen here that I'm Harry Powell, but I'm not. It's not Harry Powell. It's Graham McDonald. Making my second attempt at hosting with Spencer Kite again. If you watch the balance breakdown, thanks very much. And hopefully I can do Harry some kind of justice, or at least make you appreciate other people's hosting when normal service does resume. How are you getting on it, Spencer?
I'm good, man. That's a good lead, and you are not Harry Powell. That's the way I'm going to start doing things when I turn up, like unexpectedly. Whenever I guest on this, I'll be like, I hope I make you appreciate what Harry and Ian do by being here. Good way to put it.
Yeah, it's a slapdash attempt at learning how to host, but I'll do my best, and I'm sure Spencer will help me along the way. Obviously, this is as I said, this is a grudge match that has been talked about for a long time now. It was kind of slated to happen before, and there was a lot of talk back and forward on who's from where and who's the real African champion and all this stuff. And a lot of people maybe shied away from that, but the matter of the fact was that it definitely got, in my opinion anyway, it got people interested. And we were kind of talking about it before, me and you. Maybe it'll build up again now that it's fight week, but the kind of the edge and the big hype that I expected when this fight was first talked about, it just doesn't really seem to be there yet. Why do you think that is?
So I think some of it is just the nature of this fight coming together, right? So these two got in the cage face to face last year at UFC 290. Dricus du Plessis goes out and beats Rob Whittaker in the second round to sort of cement himself as the number one contender in the middleweight division. He's the champ, just a couple months removed from defeating Alex Pereira in Miami. And we get the showdown. We know this is what the UFC wants, is the fight everybody's looking for now, because you beat Rob Whittaker the way that Dricus did. That cements you as the number one contender. They have their arguments about who's from where and all of that stuff, and I'm sure we'll get into it here a little bit. But then Dricus isn't ready to go when they want to do the quick turnaround into September in Sydney. And so Sean Strickland steps in and just throws a wrench in the whole thing. Goes out, beats Izzy handily, wins the title, and now we've got a pivot. Dricus comes in, beats him in Toronto earlier this year, and now Izzy's coming in off a loss. And I think, so we go back to when he lost to Alex Pereira. I think for me at least, because he was so good through the first 20 minutes of that fight, even the first 21 minutes of that fight, it seemed so close to winning that decision handily. Seeing them do it again, seeing them run that back felt obvious to me, right? Izzy had been the champion for a while. We do the rematch, away we go. This one just doesn't feel the same because he didn't have much to offer, Sean Strickland. He didn't show much in that fight. Now, he's been really complimentary of Eric Nixick's coaching, saying that Nixick throughout the fight was calling out what was coming, and it kind of threw him off a little bit. And they did well to prepare for that fight and execute for that fight. But coming off a fight like that and jumping into a championship fight just doesn't quite feel the same to me. And then it feels like they've also kind of, whether by choice or by asking, have dialed back a little bit of that who's from where rhetoric. But I do expect it to get ramped back up this week. I do expect things to get a little testy this week when they see each other, when they do press engagements, things like that. They had a presser in Perth about a month ago. It wasn't as contentious as that initial face-off, but you can tell there's rivalry here. You can tell there's a lot of pride on the line here. This is a big fight for each guy in terms of legacy and going forward, and for the division going forward, quite frankly. And so as much as it doesn't feel really energetic right now as we're recording this, I have a feeling that as we get closer and closer to fight day, this will start taking on a little more weight.
Yeah, I'm thinking as you're saying there, I'd say if either guy is to say one thing that the other guy takes to heart, we could see it explode again. But I think maybe there has been a bit of a kind of concerted effort from both guys to kind of you know, when you're in that territory, maybe people can say, oh, you overstepped the line already, or maybe you went onto the line, but you're very close to, you know, disaster. You could say, you know, in a heated argument, you could say maybe the wrong thing, and yeah, maybe that's, you know, management and PR guys just being like, you know, it's hard for us to even sell this stuff if you do go too far. So, but having said that, you know, this, as you said, there's so much bad blood here. Obviously, there's a title on the line here. There's, you know, Izzy's chance at, you know, getting back to the top, and du Plessis' chance at proving that, you know, he is the best in division at the moment. So that's obviously a huge part of it. Title on the line is always important, big main event, all that. But there really is a lot of kind of ego and pride, and, you know, I think this is going to mean a lot more to these guys. And sometimes that can, you know, that can lead to maybe a bit of a tentative fight. And, you know, do you see Izzy being happy enough to accept being on the back foot here and letting kind of du Plessis do his thing of pushing forward, or do you see Izzy trying to kind of, you know, mix it up a little bit after he was kind of, you know, as you mentioned there, when Sean Strickland's coach is kind of able to predict everything you're going to do, it's like, am I kind of doing, you know, the same thing too often here, that I've become predictable? I need to change this up. And, you know, we've seen him be able to be successful going forward when he needs to be. In the past, we haven't really seen him do it much, because a lot of the time during his title reign, he was kind of able to spar to success and just kind of, you know, take it handy and not risk anything, which is obviously in a sport like this where your brain's on the line and your body's on the line. You know, it might not be the most exciting, and people maybe want more from an Adesanya over the years because they know he can do more. But, you know, maybe this is the fight that after, you know, as you said, with the Strickland fight and, you know, kind of being figured out, maybe he won't accept the back foot like you would think. Looking at both the tape on these guys previously, you probably expect du Plessis to be the one coming forward. How do you see the kind of the striking positional game playing out?
I think that's the interesting stylistic and sort of, you know, game plan dynamic of this fight is, what do we get from Izzy? Because in theory, on paper, Dricus is a perfect guy for Izzy's style. He's somebody that wants to come forward. He wants to push the action. He wants to be throwing shots at you and coming after you. And he's someone that is always fighting for a finish. There's no part of Dricus du Plessis that is going in there looking to point fight, looking to, you know, do what he needs to do to win a decision, and especially not a 48-47 close decision. He's trying to murder you when he gets in there, and he's talked about it. I talked to him for Fighters Only ahead of this fight, and he said, like, I just, that's the way I do this. Like, there's no part of me that wants to go out there and win on the scorecards. I want to put you away. And so it's going to be really interesting to see if we can see a little bit more of that sniper version of Izzy, that version of Izzy that makes the right reads and gets his shots off and is able to adjust. That was one of the great things about him throughout that sort of early run on the way up to the title and defeating Rob Whittaker the first time, is that he would make these adjustments and he would make these reads to find the shots that put guys away, that put guys down, that distanced him from these very talented competitors time and again. And then, as you said, he got the belt and it became, he could go out there and just kind of pick his spots against a Marvin Vettori or a Jared Cannonier. We didn't see the same aggressiveness maybe as we did in the first fight with Rob or the fight with Paulo Costa, where he felt like he had a bit of a point to prove. I wonder if this is a fight where he feels again like he's got a bit of a point to prove. He's now lost that title twice. You can start talking about questioning, not necessarily questioning the legacy, but questioning whether his time as an elite fighter in this division has come to an end. He's now, you know, this could be a situation where he loses back-to-back fights and he loses 3 out of 4. And, you know, we start talking about 35 and maybe the best days are behind him. So there feels like there's a lot more on the line in this fight for Izzy to me than there is for Dricus. And I think that's part of what has sort of dialed back the rhetoric a little bit too. He went out and did the thing that he's been looking forward to doing and trying to do since he got to the UFC in January, and that's win the title. He has said, and he and I talked about it when we put together that Fighters Only cover. His goal was never, I want to beat Izzy for the title. It was, I want to win the UFC middleweight title, no matter who it is. And he went and did that in January. And so that sort of takes down a little bit of that, puff the chest out, got to prove I'm the best guy in the world. He's got the big shiny belt right now that says he's the best guy in the world. Will it certainly be cherry on top of the sundae to go to Perth and beat Israel Adesanya and cement that fact? Absolutely. But I think more of the pressure is actually on Izzy. And so it's going to be incumbent on him to find the opportunities to take this belt away from the champ.
And just kind of off the actual fight itself, but do you think the UFC should have put this on in Africa? Do you think this fight, you think it could go there, or do you think the tensions, the kind of previous what's been said in the past would make it kind of a risk to do that maybe, there might be a bit of opposition to either or both of the fighters? But it seems to me, as good a chance as any, especially with the background talk to have a card in Africa. And maybe we could see a rematch depending on how this goes in the future, and they could do that. But maybe a little bit of a trick missed here.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, it's something obviously that the UFC has been talking about, and we as sort of a media and the MMA bubble have been talking about, especially through that period where we had the three kings, Francis Ngannou, Kamaru Usman, and Israel Adesanya, all from the African continent, that it could be something the UFC does, and they weren't able to make it happen during that space. I don't know where you necessarily would have put it. Obviously, there are promotions in Africa on the continent at this point. Kamaru Usman runs one, EFC in South Africa, where Dricus came through before getting to KSW and then the UFC. So certainly there are venues, but I don't know that there's necessarily the size of venue and the amount of infrastructure that the UFC would want to bring a pay-per-view kind of event to someplace like that. I can see a fight night in the next couple of years as sort of a test pilot to see how things go. I think doing it in Australia is probably the right decision in terms of being able to build up an event and center it around. As much as Dricus is the champion, you can still center it around Israel, who has done so much over the last 5 years in this division, build in all of the Anzac fighters that are on this card and go from there. So I think we are getting closer to UFC Africa, but I don't know that this was a missed opportunity.
Yeah, and the actual fight itself, I think du Plessis, maybe if you're kind of watching him against lower level guys, he's not going to look as impressive as Adesanya, but he's kind of off pace and a bit of a awkward, not quite like Keith Jardine or something like that, but a little bit like that, but obviously a lot better. I think maybe looking at it from the outside, you might think Adesanya is going to be able to outstrike him here, but we've seen so many times, especially in that Strickland fight, that like you push forward and put simple combinations together with a little bit of unorthodox speed, unorthodox tempo, and unorthodox shots. It can cause problems for Adesanya. I think Strickland. I think in the Strickland Adesanya fight, I think Strickland fought close to his best, and maybe Adesanya was taken by surprise and maybe underestimated him and things like that. But definitely add the pressure, as you said. There's a lot of pressure on this fight, especially for Adesanya, and if it starts going wrong early, I could see this kind of slipping away from him. But if I see Adesanya probably feeling his way into this fight, especially in the first round, not really committing too much and trying to kind of figure out the herky jerkiness of du Plessis, and maybe taking over the fight as the fight goes on. But this is a fight that it's really hard for me to see how it's going to play out. I just don't know what the kind of. I think a lot of it depends on what Adesanya's game plan is, how this fight is going to look.
I feel the exact same. The Keith Jardine shout for Dricus du Plessis as a comp is pretty solid. I would say Dricus obviously is a better overall athlete than the Dean of Mean. I think that's part of the thing that sort of throws people off. That style is awkward. He always says, "Oh, well, it's not awkward." And it's like, dude, it's awkward. It is. You look a little weird all the time. You look tired. You look exhausted. We know you're not now. We've seen enough of it that we know you're not, but it throws people off. And I think you're 100% correct that Izzy kind of tries to work his way into this fight, but it also feels like a fight where, as you kind of touched on, you could suddenly be looking at being 2-0 down and having to win the next 3 rounds or get a finish because this guy just keeps coming forward and you're trying to find your spots and you don't quite land. That's what happened in the Sean Strickland fight. Sean comes out in the first round and it's competitive and Sean's doing well, and then he clocks Izzy, and it's just like, what the hell happened? And next thing you know, it's 2-0 Sean, and then it's 3-0 Sean, and then it's 4-0 Sean, and it's like, you've got to get a finish. You have to come back and finish this dude that doesn't often get finished. Dricus is kind of a similar build. He's only been finished once in his career, as far as I can recall, and that's Roberto Soldic, who hits like an absolute mule, and that was down at welterweight. The last time he fought it, or I think he fought it one more time at welterweight, but he's not a guy that generally gets finished. And so this is going to be really interesting to see how quickly Izzy can get into his offense. Because to me, it feels like we know 100% what's coming from the champion side. He's coming forward. He's looking to mix in wrestling when he can. He's looking to throw those big shots and be just a big, powerful, strong boy that he is. Let's see what Izzy can get into. And let's see if that, one of the things Dricus has talked about and that has sort of become a bit of the talking point of this fight is Dricus has sort of maintained, like, you're talking about golf, you're talking about all these other things and all the happiness in the world that you have, which is great. I don't begrudge it. I want it for everybody. But you sound like a guy that's already ready to move on to the next. You've accomplished everything. You've achieved everything. You're taking up hobbies. You're really interested in your golf game. I'm really interested in fighting motherfuckers in a cage. Let's just see. That's what we're going to find out, right? Is Izzy still dialed into this? Is he able to pull back that guy that knocked out Alex Pereira less than 18 months ago? Like, that's the weird thing about this. It's less than 18 months since he lays out Poatan, who is now light heavyweight champion and just murdering fools.
Yeah.
Can he dial that back? Or is that just going to end up being the last great moment of the last Stylebender?
Yeah, and as you're kind of hinted at there, if he is kind of, sometimes maybe getting a hobby and taking your mind off things can kind of, clear your head, and it can work for some guys. But I think, like, if Adesanya hasn't, put in the work here, and he doesn't come out, with a kind of the bit between his teeth here, then like, what fight is going to get him up for this one isn't. And obviously, when you're on your first run, you're trying to prove yourself and you're trying to make money and make a secure life for yourself and your family and all that stuff. It's extremely hard to get back to that level of motivation when you've already done it. We always, like, you talk about Connor and people talk about silk sheets, but you don't have to make as much money as that to not be as hungry. Like, it's just, obviously, like, we see these guys on the way up. They'll fight every month. They'll jump in.
Well, and especially when you beat your rival, right? Especially when you finally got that one against the guy that was your boogeyman. Beat you twice in kickboxing. Came in, walked into your backyard, and beat you in the UFC, and you felt like shit, absolutely guaranteed. And then you go out and lay him out, as he did, and pull the celebration on him. That you did. Great moment.
Yeah.
How do you now decide, like, I fully understood not being up for Sean Strickland, and that's not taking anything away from Sean. That's just the magnitude of the fight. It wasn't the same. Can you get up for this guy? Because he's
maybe
up for you.
Maybe Israel watching Alex is thinking, this guy, how this should be me,
Right. 100%.
I wasn't the one flat out on the
100%
last time. So yeah, there's a lot of things that could motivate Adesanya here, but we've seen it can go both ways. A lot of pressure, a lot of that can take you out of your game a little bit. And yeah, I think I've been guilty of it over the years as well. I've kind of underrated Duplessis due to his kind of Keith Jardine tendencies, as I'll call them. But he keeps proving it. Sean Strickland is that fight, could have went either way, in my opinion. There was very close rounds there. I think, if you gave a scorecard for Sean Strickland there, then you can make an argument for that. But in the Adesanya fight, you definitely can't. Sean Strickland, was brilliant and put it together, and that's a hard one to come back from for Adesanya at the same time. So there's so much going on in the background here, even taking the bad blood and the African, all this stuff out of it. There's a lot going on here. So we'll see who will rise to the occasion and who's gonna be the champion. But I have a feeling this might end up being a pretty close fight, and we might end up seeing it again.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if this is an ultra competitive fight. I mean, obviously, as I said, Dricus is a guy that's always chasing finishes. Izzy, we know he is capable of it when he finds those shots. So this could go any number of ways, and I can't wait to see how it actually ends up going on Saturday.
Yeah, and another guy looking to bounce back from a disappointing, well, a really good showing against Pantoja, but then a really poor mistake, that kind of threw away the fight in the 5th round. And obviously, a lot of people were talking before about it being too early for him. And, in a lot of ways you could say, oh, he's about to win the fight. It wasn't too early, but I think, a bit more experience. He's never going to be doing that again. Put it that way. he's going to have learned from that. I think, Kai Kara-France is a good fighter, but surely, Usyk should be able to, have enough to kind of at least win a pretty lopsided decision here. From everything we saw in the Pantoja fight and up until the very end, he was about to be the champion, so it would be hard for me to pick against him here. But Kai Kara-France is a guy who can get into a flow and who can cause a problem for anybody. And coming off the kind of a big loss like that, first one in a while, we've seen it affect some guys in the past, so it's definitely not a foregone conclusion. But I'd be surprised if Usyk didn't get it done here.
Yeah, I'm really interested in this fight. I got a chance to talk to Steve last week for a piece that'll be up on Sportsnet later in the week, heading into 305. Obviously disappointed, right? How can you not be crushed from that fight at 301 against Alexandre Pantoja, excuse me. Where, as you said, go into the 5th round and it's essentially there for the taking. You make a mistake, he gets it to the ground, he wins the fight. We saw Steve Usyk, when they're reading the scorecards, kind of bend at the waist and look over to his corner and say 1 round, and he lost by 1 round. I agree with you that this, in theory, on paper, is a fight that, looking at what he's done very recently and in this first year of being in the UFC, and the fact that Kai is coming off having not fought since last June, having dealt with concussions, having dealt with some injuries, should be a fight that Steve Usyk wins. Kai Kara-France is still a really good fighter, though. And so it's a really interesting test for Usyk coming back out of that championship fight, where we're going to see, as you said, is this a spot where he kind of stumbles because he can't get over it? Or is this a point where he goes forward and builds off of it? Now, he and I certainly talked about it. And he said, look, I think there are some guys that you see them. The most obvious one of late is Dominic Reyes. He fights John Jones. Everybody thinks he wins, or most people think he wins that fight. And then for 3 or 4 years, he just can't get past it. He just can't ever get back to that form. He said, I don't want to be that guy. I want to be the guy that goes out and earns my way back and continues to build and grow and get back there. I think he has all the talent in the world to do it. I also think that outlook is what's going to help him get back there in relatively quick fashion.
Yeah, I'm very excited to see how he looks, and I definitely haven't, I expect him to be back in the title picture sooner rather than later. Another guy who maybe, style has maybe held him back from maybe the title picture, Gamrot, taking on Dan Hooker. Obviously, Dan Hooker is a bit of a fan favorite. It'll probably be a big crowd in his favor. He's fought some of the best guys. Maybe when he's fought, the best guys, it hasn't really worked out. Obviously, Islam and Arnold Allen, Michael Chandler, Dustin Poirier, these aren't easy fights. And even back to when he lost to Barboza, but he has some good wins in there. But maybe a guy who at the very top level isn't able to get it done. Do you think Gamrot, has enough here to stifle Hooker long enough to win a decision here, or how do you see this fight going?
I'm really curious about this fight because Dan Hooker is an absolute savage. He's never been in a boring fight, at least not of his own doing. He is constantly looking to attack, fighting for the first time since busting his arm, as he called it, only a flesh wound, against Jalen Turner. He actually broke it a second time. That's why he's been out this long. He was supposed to fight last year in Austin against Bobby Green, broke it just before then, has subsequently finally let it heal properly and not been an idiot going back to the gym too early. And now we get him back. Gamer's an interesting guy because technically, from a technical standpoint, he can out wrestle Dan Hooker every day of the week. It's just a matter of if Dan Hooker can draw this man into making some poor choices. And if Dan Hooker can stop some of these takedowns, then what do we get? Because the game plan, I think, and I think all of us know it, is Gamrot's going to look to wrestle, put Dan Hooker on his back. Yes, he's still dangerous. He's got some submissions. He'll be throwing those elbows up, but it's go out and grind this dude. I think he can do it. I think it is, as you said, the thing that's limited his upside thus far in terms of getting some of these bigger opportunities. He feels to me like the guy that's just outside of that championship conversation where, you know, Arman Saryukin, and he has a win over Saryukin, debated or not, still sits there in his resume as a win over Arman Saryukin. But outside of that group with Saryukin and Charles Oliveira, Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, that sort of set, Max Holloway, whether you want to throw him in there after, and the knockout. But this is a big one for him. If he can go out and have a really dominant performance against Dan Hooker, it puts him in that number one contender kind of zone. It puts him in that territory for maybe making a case, because he was a 2-weight champion in KSW. He's looked overall pretty good since coming to the UFC. But I'm just curious if he can have a dynamic enough performance against a guy like Dan Hooker that sort of elevates him beyond, yeah, we all know he's really good, but he hasn't given us that wow moment yet, and that pop moment yet that makes us believe it's time for a title shot.
Yeah, and you know, if it was a meritocracy, you probably make a pretty decent argument a couple of times over the last couple of years for Gamrot. But you know, this fight, I think Gamrot, he kind of gets the very best out of his ability. He sticks to a game plan. He's heavy on the wrestling. He goes all out till he gets it, and I think that's a bad style matchup for Dan Hooker here. I think it's probably going to be, you know, a lot of boos ringing around, and we might get the odd stand up if Gamrot's not careful and doesn't kind of flurry enough on while on top position. But you know,
it's a tricky fight in that regard too, right? Because you go out and do the thing that you need to do to neutralize this guy's weapons, but because you're not necessarily maybe doing enough, and he's not a guy that's...
What's Dana going to say if that plays out like that in the, you know, he's going to be like, oh, this guy, like, is this terrible, nearly ruined the card, and you know, he'll be ragging on him.
And he's not somebody that's chasing submissions and is heavy on the ground and pound.
But do you think he should be? You think Gamrot should be like, okay, I can win, you know, 9 out of 10 fights doing what I've been doing, and I'm probably not going to get a title shot, but if I go out there and kind of take a few more risks and kind of maybe stand a bang or even posture up and just go for, you know, don't be so position kind of heavy or position safety heavy as much as he has been. And, you know, it's definitely a risk. And, you know, if you're playing a football match, you'd say, oh, you know, any other sport, you just beat them whatever way is the easiest way to beat them, and you move up the standings. But in the UFC, it's not like that, especially with like that. You know, Dana's dislike for boring wrestlers, as he would call them.
I think you got to be a little bit more cognizant of that going forward, as both Gamrot and just wrestlers in general. You have to be more aware of the expectation to finish or the pressure to finish and chase moments. Unfortunately, for some guys, that's going to mean straying from the game plan and straying from the strength a little bit, trying to force the action a little bit more. I think somebody as high level as Gamrot and anybody that followed him in KSW before he came to the UFC understands how high level he is. I believe he's 21-2 for his career. Like, this is a dude that's the real deal. He is every bit the top 5, top 10 guy that he is currently in the UFC. 24-2 with 1 no contest. Like, genuine article. I think you got to press just a little bit more. You got to see if you can find some opportunities, especially if we get into a situation where it's the 3rd round and you're up 2-0. If you feel confident and you feel comfortable that you've salted away the first 2 rounds using that wrestling, shutting down Dan Hooker, then I think you got to get after it a little bit more. A few more elbows from top position. Look for that Kimura that you like. Look for that getting around to the back that you're capable of. See if you can find something, because that's what's going to take you beyond sort of those all action fighters that we know are constantly in the mix.
Yeah, absolutely. Another one, you know, is it it's not opening this, there's one before that, sorry. Taito Ivasa and Rosenstruck, a heavyweight battle. Maybe, you know, obviously the Taito Ivasa tie is why they have it on this card, but this probably would have been a better main event for the last fight night. But you know, Rosenstruck and Taito Ivasa, who do you think is getting knocked out here?
I don't know, but I'm looking forward to seeing how it plays out. I wrote my preview for this event earlier today as we're recording this, and that's exactly how I wrapped it up. There is a high likelihood that somebody is getting knocked out in this one, and finding out who that is going to be fun for as long as it lasts. Ty comes in on a 4-fight losing streak. Rosenstruck got back into the win column, beating Shamil Gaziev earlier this year, battered him into retirement, essentially exhausted him to where he quit on the stool in between the 4th and 5th rounds. it's really interesting to me. Like Ty is somebody that I have constantly rooted for. One, super gregarious personality, hard not to like a guy that walks out to Barbie girl and all kinds of different weird stuff and just genuinely loves what he's doing. But you also see the upside and you see the athletic potential. Still only 21, or not 21, 31. But it's just been a slide lately, and it's 4 straight finish losses. And you kind of start to wonder where he's at career-wise. Rosenstruik's going to be dialed in. We know what he brings to the table. We know he's going to be looking for the knockout, as will Bam Bam. But I don't know how it plays out. But as you said, somebody's getting knocked out, and we'll find out who.
Yeah, and opening up the main card, as I thought this one was, but it wasn't. Lee against Prates. You know, it's obviously it's you're not going to be able to put Australians on or New Zealanders or that area of the world on every fight, but this fight just seems a little bit out of place to me. It just seems like, why? Maybe I'm missing something. Maybe somebody has a camp background that you can tell me about for why this fight is opening with the main card.
I think it's just an opportunity to try to showcase Carlos Prates and see what they have, right? 2-0 coming into 2-0 so far in his rookie year in the UFC, comes from that Fighting Nerds camp that has had a great deal of success coming off of Dana White's Contender Series. I think that's sort of the rub here, right? Here's a guy that we cultivated, that we brought into the promotion just last fall. He's already gone 2-0, knocking guys out. He's an action fighter. He's won 9 straight. The last 8 of them are by stoppage. And now we put him in there against a experienced fighter from this side of the globe, at least, in Li Jingliang, who's fighting for the first time in 2 years. And so it feels to me like a chance to see what we've got in Carlos Prates. He's 30 years old already. And so it's not necessarily you got to go now, but there's also not a lot of reason to keep bringing him along slowly against sort of middle of the pack welterweights. Li Jingliang is somebody that was in the rankings for a number of years before he had this 2-year layoff with injuries. You know what it means to beat him. You know what it takes to beat him. And if Prates can go out and pick up a 3rd straight win and ideally pick up a 3rd straight finish, then you've got a guy in his first year off the Contender Series, kind of similar to Jack Della a couple years ago, where it instantly becomes, okay, who is this dude? Let's start moving him up the rankings. Let's start seeing what we can get him into. Because welterweight feels like one of those divisions where there's a bunch of tenured older guys still kind of sticking around the rankings or just outside. And it's perfect time for a guy like Prates, if he is the genuine article, to come in and start taking some of those guys out. So I think that's why this fight is here.
Fair enough. I suppose closing out the prelims is a big heavyweight fight. Junior Tafa, 5-2, probably too early to be in the UFC. But having said that, the heavyweight division is so light that maybe he could get something going here. This is really hard to pick. I'd say there's another one where somebody's probably going to get knocked out. You're just not really sure who. Do you maybe see Walker trying to mix in a bit of grappling possibly, or do you see this being a straight shootout on the feet?
I see the battle of the younger brothers being a straight shootout on the feet. I know Junior is somebody that comes from a kickboxing background. Spoke to him and Justin for a piece that's in Fighters Only this month. The plan, I believe, at some point is for Junior to go down to light heavyweight. He's built more for that division. It will take cutting some weight. Obviously, he's a big kid, but this just feels like one of those go out, rock'em sock'em robots and see who gets it done. Walter Walker lost his debut to Lucas Stresky. Didn't look great. Obviously, younger brother of Johnny Walker. And so I think we get a kind of it might be too early for this to be fighting for your spot on the roster because it is the heavyweight division, relatively shallow, but both of them are coming off losses. Didn't look great in those fights. Kind of need to go out and show a little something. So I think we get both of them. Obviously, Junior Tafa is going to go out there and look to take your head off all the time. It's the only thing he knows. It's the only thing he thinks about doing. He just wants to ring heads. And so probably a path to victory for Walter Walker if he wants to wrestle, if he wants to grapple a little bit. I just don't know the depth of skill that's there in that regard. I think we end up with a slugfest, probably a little ugly, probably a little sloppy, but probably somebody ends up looking up at the lights.
If it goes long, I'd say it could be extremely sloppy.
Oh, it could be gross. It could be a gross way to end the, like, it's weird that this is the last fight of the prelims, because depending on how everything else goes before it, if this doesn't end early, we could start getting into that running out of time period or going over like we did in Manchester. And so you're praying that it ends quickly, and you're praying that some of these earlier fights end inside the distance as well.
Yeah, we haven't had dark matches in a long time. There used to be regular enough where they'd move. Maybe I'm forgetting some, but we haven't seen that in a while. They seem to be reluctant to do that, even if you never know. We might see it return. Also on the prelims, Josh Culibao, is that how you pronounce that? Probably not. Versus Ricardo Ramos.
Pretty close.
Oh, I'm awful at butchering names, so I just I don't know. Even guys, that have been around for years, I get told 3 years later that I'm pronouncing their name wrong the whole time. So nothing personal there, but yeah, this is probably a difficult matchup for Ramos. How do you see this one going?
It's interesting, right? Ricardo Ramos is one of those dudes that for the longest time, I kind of feel like we've been sitting around waiting for him to put it together, right? You see the potential, you see some of the good moments, the knockout of him in Zahabi at Madison Square Garden, the knockout of I believe it was Danny Chavez, the same way, where he sets up the spinning back elbow. And so you see the really good moments, but then the last two fights, you see the bad ones, where he goes out and he gets himself stuck in guillotines in back-to-back fights in the first round by just being too aggressive, too rushed, too hurried. He's somebody that does a lot of weird stuff. He does that behind his lead leg kick that doesn't register any damage, that doesn't do anything other than look cool on TV, and it doesn't even really look that cool. And so you kind of, for me at least, I always sit here going like, can we just get the best version of you at some point consistently? Still only 29, but feels like one of those guys that when he's 35, we're going to be sitting around going, well, he's still only 35. Maybe he'll put it together. Other hand, Josh Culibao is a guy that what he's going to bring to the table. He's going to be dialed in. He's going to give you the best effort that he can every single time out. Losing to Lerone Murphy last summer, no shame in that. Lerone Murphy's undefeated, rising star in the featherweight division. Loses to Danny Silva last time out, split decision. Silva misses weight. Kind of a debatable decision. If you scored it the other way, certainly not mad at you. And so to me, it feels like a fight where the pressure is more on Ricardo Ramos to come out and show something. Ideally, we see Josh Culibao at his best. I think, as we've seen the last couple fights, it's probably going to be opportunities to jump a guillotine early. So we may get Dustin Poirier jumping on X being like Gilly season. But to me, the pressure and the responsibility in this fight all falls on Ricardo Ramos.
Yeah, it could be a case of either guy loses, they're really kind of on the
up
verge
against
of,
it, 100%.
Yeah.
Both coming in on 2 straight losses in a division where there's always new fighters coming through. We've got Contender Series starting this week, so there's going to be a bunch more featherweights probably getting that graduation slip up to the UFC. So kind of a tough spot. Both guys, a lot to prove here.
Yeah, and before that, Casey O'Neill and Luana Santos. Casey O'Neill, it was a lot of hype behind her. She obviously, the Roxanne Modafferi fight probably, wasn't a great performance, but got the win. But since then, it's been, cancelled bouts, losses. It's been a real roller coaster for her. I think there's been a couple of bad injuries in there. Maybe it was an ACL. It's a injury.
She tore her ACL a few months after the Roxanne Modafferi fight. I think she had a fight booked and blew out her knee, canceled that fight, and then came back a little early for the Jennifer Maia fight.
Yeah, so it's kind of it's hard to know what the situation is now. How much is that knee affected, or is it like I've injured my knees myself, and you hear a lot of people who have injured ACL saying it may be okay, but in your head to actually trust it fully is kind of another battle that you have to go through, and to not be worried about that, and to not have it on your mind, and to not kind of do things to not kind of how would you say, to not risk future injury. So maybe enough time has passed now that she's over that, but she's another one who the kind of pressure's on now. Are you going to be that contender, that kind of hot prospect that people thought you were? Has this injury set you back so much that you're never going to be there, or were you never that good? There's a lot of questions around her, and it's a not an easy matchup to go in there. Like, Santos has been on a bit of a streak herself. She's settled into the UFC. She's undefeated in the UFC. Her only loss is to Jenna Bishop. A split decision. I didn't see the fight, but a split decision would lead you to believe that it was a close fight. So it's definitely no easy matchup. And people probably would have expected Casey O'Neill to kind of be at a different stage in her career now, but this is a massive proving fight, in my opinion, for Casey O'Neill.
Yeah, this is one of those ones where if you're Casey O'Neill, the pressure went from somewhat in the original matchup. She was originally scheduled to face Teresa Bleda in this fight, to now it's ratcheted all the way up because Luana Santos is the real deal. I was in Denver for her fight with Maria Agapova. She strolled in for our interview session. She knew what we were going to talk about with the weight situation. Previous fight, she'd gone up to bantamweight, accepted a short notice fight against Stephanie Egger at bantamweight, missed weight for bantamweight. Turns out when she goes back and does all the figuring everything out, she had a lymph node issue. She got that all under control, rolls into Denver looking great, ready to go, dominates Agapova, and then raises her hand right away. There's an opening, let's go. Somebody in the rankings, I'm in. This puts a ton of pressure on Casey O'Neill, who's Scottish born, but raised in Australia. So she gets a home fight, goes from facing somebody that she should beat handily in Teresa Bleda to somebody that could very well come in and hand you a third straight loss. This is going to be Casey's first camp working with the crew at Fight Ready. She was at Extreme Couture all the way through her UFC career prior to this. I think you're right about the knee. I think she came back too early for the Jennifer Maia fight. Didn't necessarily trust it. And also just walked in against somebody that had fought for the title. And right up until Talia Santos goes to a split decision with Valentina Shevchenko, Jennifer Maia was the only person that took a round off Valentina Shevchenko. And a lot of people went crazy about that, singing the praises of her. So you kind of forget how good Jennifer Maia is just because she's been around, and then she subsequently was released from the UFC, but had a win on the weekend at Invicta where she's going to fight for the title next. So still a really capable fighter. And if you're 25 years old, as Casey was at the time last year, and coming back off a knee injury and trying to figure things out, and you've got the pressure of a 0 in the loss column, I think it was just a storm of things working against her. And then that probably contributed to the loss against Ariane Lipski, if we're being honest, where you're just, now I'm not undefeated. So that's out the window, and I'm bummed about that. I'm having some issues in terms of my camp and feeling comfortable where I am and how everything's going. And so it just goes sideways. Now she's hit reset. She's gone to a new gym. She's back home in Australia, but the pressure's on. And she is somebody, as you said, when she started in the UFC, she rattles off those 4 straight wins. She was part of that pack with Macy Barber of young emerging talents in the division, even before Aaron Blanchfield rolled into town. But one of those athletes that was considered the future of this division, these young stars that are rising through the ranks, potentially to challenge then Valentina Shevchenko for the title. Now she's at a position where it's, you still good enough to be in the top 15? Are you still able to hold on to this position? It's going to be really interesting because I think Luana Santos is playing with house money in this one, and coming off that win can just go in and be like, let's see what happens, because she's 24. You lose this one, fine. You lost somebody in the rankings on short notice. Big deal. Lots of time to reset. Lots of time to figure it out going forward. For Casey O'Neill, there's not as much time.
Yeah, I think that's an underestimated thing. People, obviously, you're preparing for somebody, an opponent, a different style, and then it gets changed last minute, and people kind of go, oh well, for example, in this case, Santos, she's not going to be ready. Oh, even if you're fit, you're not fight fit. You're not match fit or whatever. And Casey O'Neill, though, in this case, I think it actually adds more pressure to her. I think, as you said, it's kind of a free shot for Santos here. People will be back on the Casey O'Neill train. Oh, she's back if she does win, and if Santos wins, then you kind of, you're kind of taking the place of Casey O'Neill, and it's the stakes on this fight. It's an interesting one, and it's another one that's hard to call because is Casey O'Neill able to get back to what she was before? Has she improved between a couple of years ago and now with all the injuries, trying to recover from that, all the rehab, all that stuff? How much time has she had to actually work on her game? And it's definitely an interesting one, and it's one that will give us a lot of answers. There seems to be a lot of these fights on the card, and the Jack Jenkins Herbert Burns one maybe is a case of Herbert Burns has to win, or he's gone. Maybe you could make an argument that he maybe shouldn't even be still in the UFC. He's looked extremely. He's just looked extremely outmatched in his last couple. Obviously, losing by exhaustion from damage. It's a bit of a unique way to lose, but the last one, Julio Arce getting punched out.
It just hasn't gone well in the last few.
It's been a bit of a disaster, hasn't it?
And there were injuries in there, but like the Daniel Pineda fight, if I recall correctly, he dominates the first round and has Daniel Pineda sort of in a bad spot, and then Daniel Pineda does what Daniel Pineda does and rallies back and gets a finish. Then he fights Bill Algeo. I think he injured his knee in that fight, but also just kind of the same thing. Had some energy for the first round. Bill Algeo, polished veteran, knows how to navigate this stuff, gets through it and just puts it on him to the point that Burns can't even get up and compete early in the second round. And then the Arce fight coming back after almost 2 years away, misses weight, or no, Arce missed weight for the fight, but gets a point deduction in the second round. Just again, doesn't have anything in that second round for him. It's a good matchup for him here because Jack Jenkins is coming back to kind of backpack off the Casey O'Neill thing, coming back for the first time off an injury, injured himself last year in Sydney, basically was getting taken down, kind of braced himself and blew out his elbow. Not as bad as Joe Pyfer's, but similar kind of thing. And so you got to see where he's at mentally and physically in terms of trusting that arm, trusting that he's 100% back. But he's a guy that, isn't going to give Herbert Burns very many moments to rest and work into this fight and get going. He's going to come out and he's going to be pounding those leg kicks. We're going to hear 53 times on the broadcast that he's broken people's shins and he's finished fights by breaking people's shins and bones and all of that stuff with his low kicks, which he has done. I'm not saying it hasn't happened, but this is one where it's do or die for the younger of the Burns brothers.
Yeah, I think Jenkins, the game plan would likely to be to drag this long to not maybe obviously if you can do damage to the legs early, that's a bonus. But I think the longer the fight goes, the more plays into his favor. And yeah, I think without kind of being too down on Herbert Burns, I just think it seems to me like he doesn't even take it too seriously. He hasn't. To me, he hasn't really improved at all. When you're taking so many losses and you don't seem to be addressing those problems in your game, it just seems like this isn't going anywhere.
It feels like it's, if we can get this done early, great, and then if we can't, there's no plan B. And against the guy in Jack Jenkins, whose nickname Farjack comes from, and I know this because I talked to him, an Australian racehorse named Farlap, who was a distance horse, and he was named such because of his conditioning. 100%, as you said. Come out there, just start battering on this guy and say, come on, we're going into deep water. Come swim. Herbert Burns isn't going to be able to swim.
We might see Herbert Burns on the ground calling for a bit of, come into my guard, right. Please, my legs aren't working.
Please come grapple with me.
Before that, we have Tom Nolan and Alex Reyes. How do you see this fight going? It's maybe a bit. Is it a bit too early for Tom Nolan, or do you know much about Tom Nolan?
I do, as the guy that covers the Contender Series for the UFC website. Obviously, watched his win last year to get to the UFC. I'm high on Tom Nolan in that you want to give me a guy that's big and tall for the division, has some varied striking, clearly is somebody that likes going out there and throwing hands and knees and elbows and all of the things, uses his length well. I'm certainly interested. Fundamentally, there are some defensive mistakes and there are some defensive holes that he needs to address. He get knocked out in his promotional debut by Nick Moda. He got dropped last time out by Victor Martinez. He needs to cover up a little more. He needs to move his head a little more. He needs to continually use that length. But this to me just feels like a showcase opportunity for the big Australian against the guy in Alex Reyes that, is 0-2 in the UFC, fought for the first time in 6 full years last year at Noche UFC, losing to Charlie Campbell. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe Alex Reyes dials it up and is ready to go. And, being able to get a second fight inside of a calendar year, we get a little bit more freshness, but he's also somebody that's in his mid 30s or maybe even in his late 30s now. This feels like a showcase opportunity for the big train. I expect him to go out there and pick up a win for Australia early in the card.
Yeah, I agree. It seems that they've chosen a showcase fight for him. They seem to, want to kind of expose him, kind of give him that big pop in front of his home audience and all that stuff. And, I was looking at the odds earlier, and he's by far the biggest favorite on the card. I'm just trying to pull it up here. He's minus 1,100. Which
is a ridiculous line for somebody in their third UFC fight. They get knocked out in their debut. I think he's got 7 fights overall as a professional. He got dropped last time out by Victor Martinez. Now he still came back, won the fight, busted him up on the ground off his back with elbows, and then finished him with a just debilitating knee to the midsection. But that's still, you're still going. That feels very much like Maria Agapova and Shauna Dobson back in the day, where it's, okay, this person has all the potential in the world, but we've seen him get dropped. We've seen him get beat. So if you are a punter that is looking for some long odds, Alex Reyes might be worth a sprinkle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's 800 or 900, or minus 900. They say if you always bet on those fights, you'll end up historically in MMA. You'll end up with a big profit. Anyway, I remember was it the Holly Holm, Ronda Rousey? There was people putting out stats and if you just bet every single favorite. So obviously don't. We'd never recommend betting anything you can't afford to lose, but a couple of quid can go a long way there, even a $5. It's tempting when you see one of these and the guy has obviously Tom Nolan is an up and comer, but a guy with holes in his game and a more experienced fighter like Alex Reyes, you see them odds, I'm tempted, even though I obviously would be surprised if Reyes got the job done. Before that, Keenan Song and Ricky Glenn are the second fight of the night. Both kind of mid-level guys. Maybe Keenan Song is probably more well-rounded, in my opinion. But how do you see this fight going?
This one's interesting to me. So I got the chance to talk to Ricky Glenn for the UFC website last week before he left for Australia. Moving up to welterweight for the first time in his career, was a featherweight for the majority. Last 5 fights, I believe, at lightweight, where he thought he was going to be able to have some great success. Debuted with a knockout win over Joaquim Silva, battles Grant Dawson to a draw when Dawson was still undefeated, but then gets knocked out by Christos Giagos and Drew Dober. It's the first time in his career he's been TKO'd. It's the first time in his career he's lost back-to-back fights. Talking to him last week, Ricky Glenn is a guy that is wrestling with where he's at in his career. Just wrestling with that frustration of all those things I thought for myself, all those things I held out for myself. I'm not going to be a champion in the UFC. I'm not going to be a top 10 guy. Said to me flat out, that top 10 dream is probably dead. I turned around and asked him, is this kind of freeing though? And he was like, yeah, in a way. There's no expectations. I get to just go out there and have fun. So I'm really interested to see what he has to offer, because he was good at featherweight. He was good at lightweight. He's a well-rounded, talented dude. He's big still for the division at 6'3". So let's see. Keenan Song is a durable, sturdy, good, experienced hand. This is going to be a fun fight. I expect this one to be entertaining. It doesn't have any stakes. There's no, to use your word, there's no jeopardy to this one. This isn't going to change the landscape of welterweight, but it should be a good, entertaining scrap between a couple of veterans. And I want to see how Rick Glenn responds to being in this position that is completely unfamiliar to him, but accepting that he feels a little bit like he's at that Jim Miller point of, okay, now I just want to go out and I still want to compete. Let me have some fun fights and see what I can do. I'm not going to cut a bunch of weight anymore. That's stupid, as we always talk about on these programs. Fuck weight cutting. So he's not doing it anymore. let's see. This could be, I don't think we're getting a resurgence. I don't think we're getting suddenly a Rick Glenn renaissance, but can he put together a couple of fun wins fighting out the string at welterweight? Maybe.
Yeah, I actually hadn't even noticed that he moved it to 170. Obviously, Keenan's songs at 170, but it just kind of hadn't clicked for me. But it is interesting when a guy changes weight class, and as we talked about it before, sometimes you're cutting so much weight that you just can't have the time to actually develop and to even enjoy the training. And hopefully, it could go both ways. Having the pressure off in that way, could make you take your foot off the pedal behind the scenes, or it could remotivate you. So it's kind of one that could swing either way. And this is a difficult fight to call, and there's a number of fights on this card that are kind of hard to know how they're going to play out. So it's an interesting card, even on the prelims. Another guy who's kind of the prelim opener, the card opener, Stuart Nickel. He's kind of I don't know if you've been researching into his background. He's kind of a bit of an unknown quantity. It seems to me the positioning of the card, the UFC matchmakers probably expect him to win here. Bringing him in, kind of putting him as the first fight of the night, trying to bring in the locals. How do you see this one going?
This one's really interesting to me. Stuart Nickel, 8-0 as a pro, obviously unbeaten, 29 years old, turns 30 in November. He's been fighting in beatdown promotions, which isn't, so to me, what I know of the Australian MMA scene, when I'm looking at prospects, when I'm looking at guys coming forward from that area, I want to see the guys that are thriving in Eternal MMA. That is their, in my opinion, top promotion. You can only beat the guys that they put in front of you. And so far, he's beaten all the guys that they've put in front of him. He's won his last 4 by stoppage. So you certainly always want to see that as well. That's something the UFC is looking for. I agree with you 100% that this is get locals in the door right out of the chute, get an Australian guy in there, see if we can't start the night with a win. Jesus Aguilar is no easy out. He's a guy that, yes, he lost his promotional debut. Fine. It came to Tatsuro Taira, who is now in the mix as one of the top contenders at flyweight. He subsequently won his last 2 fights, including absolutely cracking an Australian veteran in Shannon Ross, 2 fights back to get his first win. This is a tough fight. I think anytime we get flyweights, it's usually an entertaining fight. So it's a great way to start the night. But I don't know that this is necessarily what you want to be doing on the start things off with the undefeated Australian, where he could very well end up catching a loss right out of the gate.
Yeah, as I agree with a lot of that. I think, usually in this situation, we might see a bit of an easier matchup, promotional debut, kind of get the crowd going. But this is definitely, a guy who already has his feet under the table. As you said, he has a impressive overhand right, first round knockout, and he has albeit a split decision, but he's gone 3 rounds. He's settled in the UFC a little bit. He's 3 fights, 2 wins, 1 loss, and he probably feel a little bit disrespected here, being put in this place, kind of teed up a little bit. So, I say he's going to come in and fighting like a dog, and I don't know Stuart Nickel very well, but we haven't seen him in adversity really. If he's going out there and putting everybody away in the first round for the main part. Obviously early on in his career, he was fighting like 0-0 guys, 2-2 guys, 3-1, all that stuff normal. This is definitely a big step up. Will he be nervous himself? He hasn't fought in the UFC. He hasn't even fought in any big promotion. As you were saying, I'm not sure what kind of crowds beatdown promotions are drawing, but he was fighting on their 3rd ever show, their 5th ever show, their 6th ever show. They're unlikely to have experienced anything like this before. There's going to be a lot of talk. You're undefeated.
Pressure's on you at home. Yep, absolutely. Yeah, this is Jesus Aguilar gets to come over and, as you said, have that chip on his shoulder of why am I opening the show against this guy that's just showing up? I've got 2 on a hop here.
This guy, I'm going to show you.
You think this unbeaten kid's going to come in and beat me? Sure, let's go.
Yeah, so there's definitely a few interesting ones there. It's always interesting when a guy's undefeated and you've never really seen him, and take a big step up in competition. It can go both ways. It can be like, oh, what were they thinking, or it can be like, oh, this guy's one to watch. So definitely a bit of extra interest for an opening prelim that maybe hasn't been there in a lot of recent cards. So I can see that being a big thing to get the crowd in there. Obviously, they did it. They've done it in like UK shows and Irish shows over the year, and it definitely adds to the atmosphere. And if you can get the results rolling, this could end up being a huge night for Australian MMA and that oceanic Asian MMA kind of scene in general, because there's a lot of guys on the card here, but it's not one of those cards where in the past maybe a Brazilian card where they just thrown it together and there's no real close matchups or there's no real jeopardy. This card isn't at the same level as a 300 or maybe even a 304, but I think at the end of the night we're probably going to be coming out with some exciting fights and some questions answered at various divisions, especially obviously the Bad Blood title fight is going to take a lot of the attention, but for me, like people like Usyk and the Dan Hooker fight, and as we mentioned, Casey O'Neill, how's she going to look, and even this opening fight, there's definitely a little bit of everything. So really, really interesting card.
Yeah, I mean, I really like these international pay-per-views. I've written about it in the past that I understand the folks stateside that say, I don't really know as many of these people and, I don't have the connection to them. There's a bunch of competitive fights on this. The card is built for the folks that are going to be in attendance. The people in Perth are going to be absolutely bonkers for this card. Steve Ursig is a boy from Perth fighting in the co-main event. It's unfortunate that Jack Della is still hurt and unable to compete. That would have been a really great guy to see on this card as well. But these, you can't compare it to 300 or 303 even, but it's a good show. It's a good card with, as we've talked about throughout, a bunch of really competitive fights where we're going to get answers to important questions. It's not necessarily always championship jeopardy. It's not necessarily title ramifications, but a bunch of these fights have real divisional impact or can have real divisional impact going forward. And for me, especially coming off a show like we had last weekend, you want to give me a card like this on a Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening, I guess you should say, since it's pay-per-view and the main card will start at 7:00 local time here for me in Abbotsford. I'm in. Sign me up all the time. Can't wait for this main card. I like every fight on the card because we're going to, even, if you want to say, Tai Tuivasa, Jairzinho, Rosenstrike, as we talked about earlier, somebody's getting knocked out. Big boys are going to be throwing big hands. Who doesn't like that? If you suddenly decided that you don't like that, you're lying to yourself just to be critical about this fight and this card. Everybody likes seeing big meaty men throwing meat.
Yeah. It's one of the worst fights on the card, probably, and it probably would have been the main event if it was on last week.
100%.
We can't complain too much. 100%.
Right. This is a Apex main event that we're getting as the second fight of the main card with a bunch of really great stuff after it. So it should be a good card overall. And this is a blast breaking it down with you.
Thanks a million for joining me. I'm much appreciated, and hopefully, normal service will be resumed next week, and hopefully the card lives up to the kind of potential that it has. And yeah, it's nice to kind of have. Obviously, we're recording this a little bit before fight week, but it's a fight week that I'll be paying more attention to than maybe. I can't even remember the last time I watched the countdown or watched the embedded, but I have a feeling that maybe things might flare up and there might be some good pre-fight content to come this week to get people even more excited for this card, especially this main event.
I look forward to Sean busting your chops about wanting to watch embedded and see people get their haircuts and meet in elevators.
Yeah, it's so formulaic. It is a bit ridiculous. Once you've seen a few, you've seen them all. But yeah, I think the UFC. Just before we go, do you think the UFC are going to play into this kind of who's the real African, who's the thing? Do you think it's a little bit too risky even for the UFC?
I don't think they will, just because I know from talking to Drickus that he feels he's made his point, and he feels what he has said has been misconstrued a bunch of times for the sake of Izzy getting up in his feelings and turning something into it. So the whole way along, what Drickus has said has never been questioning where any of these other fighters of African heritage who were born on the continent came from, whether they're real Africans or not. What he has always said is, I'm the first fighter born, raised, residing in Africa that has won and held a UFC title. As he said when these guys met in Perth a couple months ago for a press event, kicking this off, what's my postcode? Still lives in South Africa, has been there the whole way through. That's not a knock on anybody else going anywhere. Izzy and his family moved. Francis Ngannou escaped Cameroon. Kamaru Usman and his family moved to the States. Cool. He'll tell you, I don't begrudge any of them. It's not about anyone else. It's always just about him. And I think he's done wanting to talk about it. I think he recognizes how ugly it got in that early stage. And again, as sort of we talked about earlier in the program, the thing he wanted was to be world champion. He's got that now. So he doesn't need to talk his way and sell his way into fights. He's got the belt. Now the fights have to come to him. And so I think we see him steer away from it. If I had to make a guess as to where this goes, I think we're going to get a lot of Dricus sort of poking at Izzy saying, do you still really want to do this? Do you really want to be here? Because in watching that press event earlier this summer, coming away from it, the thing that Dricus said was, he's trying to convince himself that he still wants to do this. He's trying to tell himself that he still wants to be the best in the world and he still wants to fight at this level. And as we talked about already, it's hard to get up for these kind of fights when you've been to the top of the mountain, when you have all the things that you want. And especially in this situation for Izzy, where you beat the guy that was the one thing that sort of stood out there as the guy that you couldn't beat. Well, you knocked him out. Now what? There's no more ghosts to exercise. There's no more mountains to climb. Maybe winning the title for the third time, becoming the first guy to be a 3-time UFC middleweight champion becomes the new goal. Joining Randy Couture as one of 2 people to win a title 3 times in the UFC, maybe, but we'll see.
Yeah, and it'd be interesting to see what happens after this as well, because as we mentioned earlier, he does have a devastating victory over Alex Bahia, and maybe, something like that could freshen up the, obviously he has business to deal with here. This is a grudge match now. This is bad blood, but there's more bad blood up a weight class. And, I could see him with a win here, maybe looking to move up weight class and take on Alex Bahia. I think, the middleweight is
I think it's something the UFC is certainly going to be interested in to see how Saturday shakes out. There's a reason we haven't heard any plans for Alex Bahia, and it's very well that we're waiting to see what happens here.
Yeah, brilliant. Well, thanks a million again for joining me, Spencer, and thanks to everybody who tuned in. Like and subscribe, follow Spencer. Do you want to give your handles a shout out there, Spencer, before we go?
At Spencer Kite on X/Twitter and Instagram. I'll plug everything I can as often as I can. So easiest spot to find me.
Perfect. Much appreciated. Thanks for tuning in. Good luck.